Father, may we be convinced this morning that you are our greatest need. Whatever else may be going on in our life today, it's not more important than knowing that you are always there for us. That you know what's going on in our lives. You're working in ways that we often don't understand. But in every way that you move, in every way that you reveal yourself in our lives, you're drawing us closer to you. You're building the life of Jesus inside of us. And so, Father, I pray that you will continue that good work this morning. That, Father, we will trust you. We'll put our life completely in your hands. That we will follow you and serve you and believe that no matter what's happening in our lives, you will use it for the good. We thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen. God is not nice. He doesn't always behave himself. He doesn't play fair. He doesn't always act like we think God should act. Search the Bible backwards and forwards and you'll find nothing at all said about God being nice. In fact, there are plenty of times when it seems like God is anything but nice. He floods the whole earth. He kills Egyptian babies. He makes Hosea marry a prostitute. Jesus calls the Pharisees whitewashed tombs. He curses a fig tree. In talking to Jesus, he says to him, or talking to Peter, he says, "Get behind me, Satan." How would you like Jesus to say that to you? Jesus goes into the temple with a whip, and he starts tossing the place in what appears to be a fit of rage. You see things like this in Scripture, and you go, what's up with that, God? And you don't have to go back to Bible times to ask those same questions. In November, fires raged through California, killing at least 85 people. Almost every week there's a mass shooting somewhere. Horrible accidents happen to seemingly innocent people. 29 kids perish in a grisly bus accident on the highway. One person gets cancer and recovers, and the other doesn't. A Christian leader talks about all three of his adult children. They're grown up, they're leading godly, exemplary lives. He says, from the day we knew we were pregnant, my wife and I were on our knees every night, holding hands and praying for God's blessing on each child. As he's listening, another man is thinking to himself, it didn't turn out that way for me. One of my children is a Christian. 3 others aren't. One got a divorce. Another one ended up in jail. Maybe they didn't pray together on their knees. Perhaps that's the magic formula. And so we shape God into who we believe he is. And when he doesn't come through, we have questions. What's up with this, God? Heather Zeckel says, God doesn't claim to be nice. He claims to be loved. And there's a big difference. Our problem is that we translate God as love into God as nice. We settle for a God who's well-mannered instead of the wild, ferocious, jealous love of God. When we don't distinguish between God is always love, but God is not always nice, we miss out on who God really is. And we fail to live in his love. An incomplete understanding of God prompts us to say, my God would never, and then you fill in the blank. We've all come up with a view of God that fits comfortably how we believe a loving God should think and act. A loving God would never, we say, and then he does. Larry Crabb says, life isn't going according to plan. Have you figured that out yet? He said, nothing is ever exactly as we want it to be, at least for long. Too often, our version of God carries with it the expectation that God should do and what he shouldn't do. And when he doesn't act like we think he should, we're confused. We believe that God is tripping us up or playing some kind of tricks on us. We're putting our trust in what we think a loving God ought to do. Sometimes we talk about trusting God, and there's really sort of a subtle demand below the surface. God, I'll believe in you as long as you give me the things I deserve. After all this Bible reading and church attending and tithing and all this stuff I've done, I'm entitled to a fair shake. And when I don't get it, something is wrong, God. You're just not keeping your end of the bargain. And so when God doesn't make sense to us, the problem is not with God. The problem is with our understanding of Him. Speaking through Isaiah, God says, Isaiah 55:8-9, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Isaiah's point is that our thoughts and ways about how life should unfold for people who follow Jesus is far below the wisdom of God and His ways. Sometimes we're not going to understand how God is going about telling His love story to us. It doesn't make sense. All we know is something seems wrong. And it seems like God is not holding up His end of the bargain. Paul echoes Isaiah's words. He says, "How impossible is it for us to understand His decisions and ways? For who can know the Lord's thoughts?" It's impossible for us to know what God is up to, all that He's up to in the present moment. And who are we to think that we know better than He? Isaiah speaks again in chapter 40, verse 12. He says, "Who could have ever told God what to do or taught Him His business?" It's arrogant of us to think that we know more about how to do God business than God Himself. Paul warned the Galatians against a false gospel. He says, "I'm astonished that you're so quickly deserting the one who called you by the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all." In the case of the Galatians, they were in danger of falling back into legalism after they had learned about the grace of Christ. Today's version of a twisted gospel perverts the truth that God is a God of love into a lie that God then is always cooperative with us. God's love compels Him, we think, to act in a way that we think He should. In our thinking, God's ways are obvious, simple, and should always be fair. If I do right, then God's always going to do right by me. And that's the lie. That's not God's plan. When we believe this false gospel, that if my life is going well, I feel pretty good. I believe God is rewarding me for my good behavior. But if my life is not going well, then I become disillusioned and disappointed and with God, and I ask, what's up with this, God? This is not what I expected. Graham Cook says God is consistent, but He's also unpredictable. He's consistent in His nature. You always know where you're at with God, but you seldom know what He's going to do next. You cannot find security in what God is now doing. Your only security is in who God is. And so difficulties we didn't expect come up. Distress that we thought believers shouldn't experience tags along, and we meet the incomprehensible God. Who is He? What in the world is He up to? Why am I having these hard times? What do I do when God doesn't make sense? Well, that brings us to Habakkuk. Sounds like you're going to spit, doesn't it? Habakkuk. Many people have never heard of Habakkuk, but it's a book in the Bible. Very few have read it. We don't know how to pronounce it, let alone even where to find it. Believe it or not, this is going to sound like a crazy idea, and it probably is. I use Habakkuk as one of my ways of testing out a new secretary. I purposely misspell Habakkuk's name in an outline that she's supposed to type to see if the person catches it. So this is my twisted thinking. My twisted thinking is a real Christian knows how to spell Habakkuk and knows where to find it in the Bible if they don't know for sure. See how twisted it is? Of course, in today's world, you don't have to know how to spell anything. All you have to do is just Google it. You can find out. Well, Habakkuk is one of the minor prophets. Minor doesn't mean, however, insignificant. It just means short. Habakkuk is 3 chapters, 56 verses long. You can read through the whole thing probably in 10 minutes. But Christians don't generally like reading the prophets, especially the minor prophets. Talking about God not making sense. These guys don't make a whole lot of sense to us. They wrote at a different time to specific groups of people whom we think we have very little in common with. When we think of the prophets, we think of gloom and doom, and we think, I don't need any more of that. If I want to hear bad news, all I have to do is listen to Lester Holt or David Muir or one of those guys. The Bible's prophets lived in times and through circumstances that just don't make sense to us. They accepted the tensions of living in a fallen world while waiting for a new, better world, a world that God would usher in His own timing and His own way. Most prophets spoke for God, telling His people what they were doing wrong and the consequences that they were about to suffer. Very little Bible prophecy, however, has to do with foretelling the future. That's what a lot of people think it is. Better than 90% of it is forthtelling, declaring who God is, how He sees the current circumstances, and what's about to happen. Usually prophets spoke for God to the people, but Habakkuk speaks to God for the people. He has questions for God, and here's why. The very first verse. This is the vision with which the prophet Habakkuk was burdened. God shows Habakkuk something that was amazing and confusing at the same time. It was something that just didn't make sense to him. It went against how he saw God. The vision, or oracle is another word that's used for that, was a burden to him. And here was the vision that God gave him that we're going to see as we go through this book. God was going to use the Babylonians, the most ruthless people who lived at that time, dreaded and wicked, to invade and sack Jerusalem because the Israelites had forgotten God and were worshiping other things. In Habakkuk's mind, the Babylonians are worse than the people of Judah. Why would God use a more wicked nation to discipline His own? Habakkuk is going to push back on this because he doesn't want to give this message of doom and gloom to God's people. Habakkuk has 3 problems with God. Do you have any problems with God this morning that you want to take up with Him? Well, here's the 3 that he had. Number 1, God, you don't even seem to care. You're letting all these things happen, and it doesn't appear to matter to you. Second problem. Number 2, God, you can do something about this. You can change what happens here because you're God after all. If I were in your shoes, God, have you ever told God that? This is what I would do. Number 3, God, what you're doing just isn't fair. How can you use the Babylonians to punish us? Shouldn't it be the other way around? And so Habakkuk wrestled with some of the same questions, some of the same uncertainties, disappointments that we face in today's world. He came to understand that God does not promise us safety from the agonies of life. He is the God, however, is sovereign over the agonies of life. God does not guarantee deliverance from the valley of the shadow of death. What He promises us is His presence as He goes with us through the valleys. Habakkuk recognized that God is not always nice, but that He is always love.
Our understanding of love, however, is much different from God's. His love is more extravagant and deeper than any trial that we face in this life. But what do you do when what you see with your eyes is much different than what you believe in your mind about God? Habakkuk's name sort of gives us the answer. Because Habakkuk means to wrestle or to embrace. Habakkuk embraced God's character while he wrestled with God's actions. And as he wrestled with what he saw, he embraced more of who he came to understand God to be. Habakkuk shows us how to hold on to God when the incomprehensible realities of life are tempting you to let go and not want anything to do with Him. How do you discover God's deep love for you when He just doesn't seem to make sense? Well, Habakkuk is going to teach us that. So beginning again at verse 1, this is the vision with which the prophet Habakkuk was burdened. How long must I cry, O Eternal One, and get no answer from you? Even when I yell to you, violence is all around. You do nothing to save those in distress. Why do you force me to see these atrocities? Why do you make me watch such wickedness? Disaster and violence, conflict and controversy are all raging around me. Your law is powerless to stop this. Injustice prevails. The depraved surround the innocent, and justice is perverted. And so when Habakkuk hears what God's going to do, the first thing out of his mouth is, how long? How long? Have you ever asked God that question? How long am I going to be in this situation? How long until things change? How long until you do something, God? Habakkuk didn't hesitate to throw questions up into God's face. Believe it or not, you can have questions of God and have faith in Him at the same time. It's okay to say to God, I just don't understand this. When it comes to God, you're not always going to comprehend Him. It's part of having a relationship with Him. It's part of Him being God and you not. Everybody goes through wilderness times or crises of belief. C.S. Lewis was a strong believer and a well-known Christian writer. When he wrote A Grief Observed after going through the tragic loss of his wife Joy to cancer, his confidence had been shattered and he was to the breaking point. He said, you never know how much you really believe anything until its truth or its falsehood becomes a matter of life and death to you. You see, his faith in God was really put to the test. In the same book, he asks a question. Meanwhile, he says, where is God? When you're happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing Him, if you turn to Him with praise, you're welcome with open arms. But go to Him when your need is desperate, when all their other help is in vain, and what do you find? A door just slammed in your face, and the sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. And after that, silence. You might as well turn away. Have you been there to the point of questioning God? Habakkuk asked, why don't you say? Why must we suffer this injustice? Why do you put up with this wrong? Habakkuk is not the only one who's asked that question. You're not the only one who's asked questions of God. The psalmist asked this question at least 10 times. 5 times in chapter 13 he says, how long, O Eternal One? How long will you forget me? Forever? How long will you look the other way? How long must I agonize, grieving your absence in my heart every day? How long will you let my enemies win? When Isaiah looked around and he saw corruption and the brokenness of his people, he asked God a similar question. He said, how long will this go on? If you go all the way to the end of the story, you hear believers asking the same question, this time from heaven. In Revelation 6:10, How much longer, O Lord, the Holy One, the True One, until you pronounce judgment on the inhabitants of the earth, until you avenge our blood? You know, even Jesus asked the how long question. One time he seemed to be a little impatient with his disciples. He said, "How long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you?" Read the book of Job. Read Lamentations and what Jeremiah wrote there. These are godly people crying out, "God, have mercy. I thought I was doing everything you said. Why is this going on?" And there are a lot of why questions asked. Look at Jesus on the cross. Even though he obeyed God perfectly, as he becomes sin for us and God pours out his wrath on Jesus, God turns away and Jesus is left asking, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And so walking with God is going to take you through some crisis points. I think we do a terrible disservice in the church when we give people the impression that when I invite Jesus Christ into my life, all my problems are going to end. Everything's going to be just great and dandy in my life. God's never going to allow anything in my life that I don't understand. Well, that's just not true. Things might get worse. They might become more painful. They might lead to doubts and struggling before they get better. But if you keep holding on to God, He'll take you and your faith to places of closeness, trust, and confidence in Him that you never thought was possible. Every person that I've ever met who has a close, abiding relationship with God has gone through seasons of questioning, seasons when God just didn't seem to make sense. James tells us what's going on when God's ways seem incomprehensible to us. He says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything." God lovingly takes you through seasons of doubt, unanswered questions, times of uncertainty and insecurity, because He's doing something in your life that He can't do in any other way. So what do when you find yourself in this position? How can you move forward when you're filled with whys and how longs? Habakkuk noticed that his rules for God, and we all have rules for how we think God should be, they weren't working. He was desperate for God to show up and God to do what only God can do. When your rules for God aren't working, you need some new rules. Rules that actually drive you to Him rather than away from Him. And one of these rules is we must be desperate for God no matter what else is going on in our lives. Desperation can be a powerful reason to run to Him. You see, you only have two choices in life. You either run to God or you run away from Him. That's the only choices that you have. In Matthew 9, we hear about two people who are in some pretty dire circumstances. One of the ancient Bible scholars when they translated the Bible into Latin, they spoke of the combination of these two stories that I'm going to share with you as desperation in extremis. One of these stories is about a synagogue leader whose daughter has been sick. He runs to Jesus and he says, "My daughter has just died, but you can bring her back to life again if you come and lay your hands upon her." There's also a woman who has been seriously ill for 12 years. She's been to every doctor and specialist known to man, and nobody can help her. She says, "If I can just touch His robe, I will be healed." Here are two desperate people clinging to hope found in that whispered "if." Imagine the pain of the leader who has just lost his child. And he's still clinging to hope. In Mark's version, Jesus challenges the man's if by saying, everything is possible to him who believes. The man wants to believe, but he's struggling. He asks Jesus to help him overcome his unbelief and his doubts. Jesus not only heals his child, he drives out hopelessness in the man. Jesus could hear the conflicting messages going on in the inside, and he healed the man's heart. Jesus can heal what's broken in your heart. But you must be more desperate for him than even the healing. The woman's situation was equally desperate. 12 years unclean. That meant she was completely isolated. Nobody wanted anything to do with her. They were afraid to touch her. She was excluded. She was avoided. She was thought unacceptable. There were financial impacts. She'd been to every doctor. She probably spent most of her money. There were spiritual impacts. She couldn't go to the synagogue because of her condition. It was assumed that her problem was punishment from God for some sin that she had committed. She was cut off from people and feeling cut off from God. Both the man and the woman clung to a glimmer of hope of what can happen when we come to God with our ifs. They realized that when God steps into the equation, if can blow open the doors of heaven with possibilities of what God is doing and will do. Not only do we need to be desperate to come to God, we must be determined to bring Jesus into whatever we're experiencing. Their desperation fueled a relentless determination to come to Jesus and bring him into the middle of their situation. The official took his why to Jesus, and the woman came with her how long. They could have let their desperation drive them into further mourning and embarrassment and despair. If we're not careful, desperation can drive us to look for answers in places that promise to bring us relief, but only bring emptiness and more pain into our lives. The synagogue leader and the sick woman let their desperation drive them to Jesus because they knew he was the only one who could change their circumstances. And whether he chose to change their circumstances or not, they put their hope in him. They were putting their confidence in him, not their situations, and not even certain solutions. Sometimes, the best thing to get you running after Jesus' direction is a desperate determination to bring him right into the middle of your questions, your agonizing situation, your life and death struggle, to put your hope in him alone. So I ask you this morning, where is your desperation leading you? Does it lead you away from Jesus or to Jesus? How desperate are you to get God involved and to lean on him, to touch the hem of his garment? What if you were so desperate for God to move in your life that you were willing to seek him out no matter what and trust his actions regardless of what happens? So what questions are haunting you this morning? Where has desperation in life dropped you? Habakkuk let his questions and desperation drive him to his knees in prayer. Where is it driving you today? Would you stand with me? Father, you know the questions in our hearts today, the circumstances that we face in our life, that we have a measure of desperation about. Oh God, this morning, may we believe that you know what you're doing in our lives, and we can come to you and put all of our hope and trust in Jesus Christ. We ask this